Is this some kind of joke? The words cut through the quiet morning air like a knife, sharp and dripping with disbelief. Sergeant Kyle Harper stood at the cemetery gate, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, arms crossed, his uniform crisp and unyielding, a wall of authority against the figure before him. Harold Winters, 89 years old, stood with a slight stoop, the lines of decades etched across his pale blue eyes, his hands clasped lightly at his sides, a simple dark suit draping a frame that had carried stories the world would never know. The air was thick with tension, a breeze stirring the flags at half-mast, tugging at their edges, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant pine. The young sergeant leaned forward, voice rising with practiced authority. "Sir, this is a private funeral for General Wallace. Do you have your credentials?" Harold's gaze never wavered, his eyes calm, measured, absorbing the mockery without a flinch. He lifted a hand slightly, motioning subtly toward the reeds lining the pathway, and said in a quiet, measured voice, "I've come for General Wallace. He expected me." Harper blinked, caught off guard by the weight in the old man's tone, but quickly masked it with a scoff, stepping closer, gesturing at the gate. "Look, old-timer, rules are rules. No invitation, no entry. You need to move along, or I'll have you escorted off this property." The sound of the words seemed to ricochet across the gravestones, echoing off marble and granite, a stark contrast to Harold's composed stance. His hands remained lightly clasped, his shoulders squared despite the years, the wind tugging gently at the lapels of his suit, the faint glint of a small, tarnished pin catching the sunlight. Harper's eyes narrowed at the pin, a casual flick of his fingers sent it wobbling. What's this supposed to be? Some kind of old trinket. The moment the metal was touched, the air shifted, and Harold's mind flashed across time and space to the bitter cold and mud of a distant battlefield. The wind howled differently there, carrying a tang of wet earth and cordite, his young hands gripping tightly onto a fellow soldier, blood mixing with sweat, the weight of responsibility pressing down, the certainty of life and death, the quiet resolve of one who had endured more than most could imagine. The vision snapped back. In an instant, the cemetery still before him, the pin still glinting in the sun, Harper still smirking, unaware of the storm brewing in those pale blue eyes. A small crowd had begun to gather, a low hum of whispers threading through the air, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, sensing something unspoken in the tension. Harold stepped forward a pace, his voice low and carrying a calm authority that belied his age. "Don't touch that," he said, deliberate and firm. The young sergeant hesitated, his confidence flickering as the weight of Harold's presence pressed on him, the kind of presence that had earned respect long before any uniform could convey it. The breeze lifted slightly, rustling the leaves, brushing against the graves, carrying with it the unspoken acknowledgment of past sacrifices, the kind that demanded attention, the kind that made the careless falter. Harper's hand lingered, uncertain, and then slowly dropped, his jaw tight, realizing that the day was not going to proceed according to his expectations. Every inch of Harold's posture radiated a quiet command, a history of discipline, a life lived under rules far sterner than those of this small cemetery gate. The murmurs of the onlookers rose subtly, tension thickening the air as they sensed the impending shift. Harold's eyes scanned the small group of guards, lingering on their movements, their postures, the uncertainty creeping into their stances. And in that moment, the ordinary world of procedure began to fracture, revealing the extraordinary weight of one man's lifetime of service, experience, and silent authority. The cemetery's gravel path seemed to hum beneath his boots as he moved forward with a deliberate calm, the air around him heavy with anticipation, as if the ground itself held its breath, waiting for the moment when the quiet legend would be acknowledged, when the ordinary would meet the extraordinary, and when the first ripple of respect would begin to spread across the assembled, frozen faces of those who had dared to underestimate him. Harold Winters adjusted his stance, feeling the cold weight of the early morning air on his shoulders, the autumn sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed rows of graves. The whisper of leaves moved like a current through the cemetery, carrying the distant hum of cars approaching, the muted chatter of families in black coats, their expressions somber and watchful. "Sergeant Kyle." Harper shifted his weight, eyes flicking nervously toward the crowd, attempting to mask a growing unease behind a rigid posture. But every glance at Harold seemed to reinforce the disparity between perception and reality. Harold's gaze drifted briefly over the familiar layout of Arlington National Cemetery, each headstone a silent testament to sacrifice, a rhythm of lives once lived with courage and duty, each shadowed fold of marble whispering stories that could not be heard by those who had not been there. The small pin on his lapel caught the sunlight again, dull and weathered, but carrying the gravity of countless missions and unseen acts of service, a quiet signal that held more weight than any officer badge or ceremonial ribbon. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line as he took a hesitant step forward, speaking again with controlled sharpness. "I need to see your identification, sir. You cannot proceed without it." Harold slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the fabric worn soft from decades of use, producing a faded leather wallet. His hands, lined and steady despite the years, held it with deliberate care. He handed it to Harper without a word, the gesture measured, almost ceremonial, conveying authority without raising his voice. Harper examined the wallet quickly, brows furrowed, scanning the credentials, expecting some gap, some reason to assert power, and found none, only proof of a life of service, quietly evident, undeniable to those who knew how to read it. The young corporal's confidence faltered slightly, the edge in his tone smoothing as a moment of uncertainty passed through him. But he pressed on, gesturing vaguely toward the side gate. "Rules are rules, old man. You will have to wait or be removed." Harold's eyes, pale blue and unyielding, shifted toward the approaching figure of a young officer, Captain Hayes, who had been observing from a distance, his expression tight with comprehension. The captain's posture conveyed a mixture of caution and realization, the sense that something profound was unfolding, that the man at the gate was no ordinary elder, that his history and presence carried an unspoken weight that could alter the course of events. The air seemed to tighten, charged with quiet anticipation, the gravel underfoot absorbing the muted tension, the distant clatter of motorcade vehicles adding rhythm to the scene. Harold's hand brushed lightly against the pin again, an unconscious reaffirmation of his identity, his years, his unspoken achievements. Captain Hayes stepped forward slightly, a subtle signal, eyes locking on the guards, calculating, assessing, aware that intervention might soon be necessary, that the ordinary flow of procedure was about to be upended. The young sergeant swallowed, the corners of his mouth tightening, feeling an unfamiliar pressure, the certainty he had relied on wavering, as though the presence of Harold alone, silent, composed, and resolute, demanded a respect that could not be articulated, only recognized instinctively. The breeze lifted again, a faint rustling of the flags overhead, carrying with it the weight of countless unspoken histories, each movement of fabric a subtle reminder that some truths, some authority, did not need proclamation. Harold remained still, posture measured, eyes scanning the gate, the crowd, the line of guards, a quiet storm contained in a single man, a presence that had weathered decades, that had seen far more than the young would ever comprehend, and in that silent tension, the space between challenge and acknowledgment began to contract, drawing every observer into the gravity of the moment, the inevitability of the approaching reversal, the subtle gathering of power that had always been his alone. Harold Winters felt the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of space around him, the faint crunch of gravel beneath Sergeant Harper's boots signaling every small, measured step toward authority. The young corporal's face betrayed a flicker of doubt, a realization that the control he assumed was only an illusion, and Harold's eyes, pale blue and unwavering, held that truth with quiet certainty. The pin on his lapel glinted again in the morning sun, small and unassuming, yet weighted with decades of unspoken deeds, a silent testament to a life defined by service and resilience. Captain Hayes, standing slightly apart, watched the exchange with keen awareness, recognizing the unmistakable signs of respect owed, yet unacknowledged, a bridge between past and present, a conduit through which authority might be correctly applied. Harold's hands remained relaxed at his sides, the wind tugging gently at his jacket, yet his presence radiated a strength that required no display, no flourish, only acknowledgment. Sergeant Harper cleared his throat, attempting to reassert command, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the early morning. "Sir, you must comply. This is a restricted area. You cannot pass without proper credentials." Harold's gaze did not waver, the calm, deliberate cadence of his movements betraying no urgency, no fear, only the certainty that the truth of his service would reveal itself without argument. A low murmur arose from the gathering crowd, a mixture of curiosity, uncertainty, and the instinctive recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, a metallic tang from the gravestones, and the distant rumble of a motorcade, layering tension over the solemnity of the moment. Harold's fingers brushed the pin, an unconscious gesture of connection to the past, the memory of events long ago pressing subtly against the present, a reminder of the weight of duty fulfilled in silence and with unwavering resolve. Captain Hayes stepped forward, voice quiet but firm, signaling Sergeant Harper with a subtle nod, an acknowledgment that intervention might be necessary, that authority must align with truth. Harper's shoulders stiffened, a momentary falter in the rigid posture he maintained, as the full measure of Harold's presence, his lifetime of service, and the gravity of the situation became increasingly evident. The crowd's whispers faded, replaced by a tense stillness, each person sensing the impending acknowledgment of what had been underestimated, the unspoken respect that was about to reshape the atmosphere. Harold moved a step closer to the gate, his movements deliberate, unhurried, commanding space without demanding it, the gentle sway of his jacket in the breeze marking the cadence of time, each breath measured, each glance purposeful. The sun cast a long shadow behind him, stretching across the neatly aligned gravestones, a visual echo of the invisible weight he carried, the countless hours of silent preparation, and the authority earned over decades of service. Sergeant Harper's jaw tightened, the certainty he relied upon beginning to erode, a subtle acknowledgement that the balance of power was shifting, that Harold Winter's presence alone altered the dynamic of the space, commanding attention without a word. Captain Hayes remained vigilant, eyes scanning for further escalation, his body poised, the silent promise of action held in check, understanding that the revelation of Harold's stature would come not through argument, but through the quiet force of recognition. The gravel underfoot seemed to amplify every sound, every subtle movement, heightening the tension and the anticipation, as if the ground itself conspired with the moment, urging the young corporal to reconsider, to measure the authority standing before him, a presence tempered by experience and underscored by decades of unwavering duty. Harold's expression remained serene, eyes glinting with a calm fire, a quiet intensity that drew the attention of every observer, signaling that patience and composure could command far more than shouted orders, that respect and recognition could not be forced, only earned, and that the moment of reckoning was imminent. Harold Winters took a measured breath, the faint chill of the autumn morning brushing against his face, carrying the distant scent of damp earth and cut grass, the gravel crunching lightly beneath his worn shoes as he shifted weight from one foot to the other. Sergeant Kyle Harper, sensing the subtle shift in authority, tightened his jaw and glanced over his shoulder, the younger guards following his lead, their expressions a mixture of irritation and growing unease as they tried to assert control over a situation that was quietly slipping beyond their command. Harold's eyes flicked briefly toward the wreaths and headstones, the sunlight glinting off the polished stones and casting long shadows across the neat rows, each marker a quiet reminder of the sacrifices that had gone largely unnoticed by those who were now questioning him. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, hands at his sides, posture straight, yet relaxed, radiating a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding him, the breeze lifting gently at the lapels of his dark suit, catching the light and drawing attention to the small, tarnished pin that seemed almost insignificant until one understood the depth of its meaning. Captain Hayes, observing from a distance, recognized the significance, the subtle cues that indicated this man's presence carried more weight than any uniform, any regulation, any attempt at intimidation, and he began moving quietly, positioning himself in case his intervention was needed, a silent guardian bridging the gap between authority and respect. Harper attempted once more to assert control, his voice carrying an edge that sought to mask doubt. "Sir, you cannot proceed without the proper authorization. You must step aside until verified." Harold's gaze remained steady, the pale blue eyes reflecting decades of experience, each one of them earned through patience, perseverance, and service that transcended ceremony. He lifted a hand slightly, pointing toward the path where the motorcade had begun to arrive, the gesture subtle yet imbued with purpose, a quiet reminder that he belonged there not by accident, but by connection, by history, by duty fulfilled long before the day had begun. The crowd, a growing mix of military personnel, family members, and onlookers, fell into a hushed anticipation, sensing the quiet shift, the gathering weight of recognition that had yet to be spoken aloud. Harold's fingers brushed the pin again, a gesture that seemed almost instinctual, linking past to present, a trigger for memories held tightly, a signal to the observant that he was not a man defined by age, but by the life he had lived and the respect it commanded. Captain Hayes stepped slightly closer, eyes scanning the surroundings, noting the subtle tension in the guard's posture, the tightening of Harper's stance, the flicker of uncertainty in their movements, and he silently prepared to act, to facilitate the acknowledgment that was beginning to form, an invisible thread connecting the present confrontation with the weight of history. The wind rustled through the trees lining the cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of engines, the world seeming to hold its breath as the interplay of authority, respect, and unspoken understanding unfolded, a delicate balance poised on the edge of recognition. Harold moved another careful step forward, the gravel beneath his feet releasing a soft, steady crunch, each movement measured, deliberate, an unspoken command to those around him that his place was not granted by permission but earned through a lifetime of quiet dedication. Sergeant Harper's confidence faltered further, the rigid assurance he had relied upon beginning to crack, a subtle acknowledgment that the presence before him, the man who had endured and witnessed more than any instruction manual could convey, was not to be underestimated, and that the balance of power in this moment was shifting imperceptibly but irrevocably. The crowd remained silent, absorbed by the unspoken drama, the shifting dynamics, the quiet authority emanating from Harold, a presence that drew attention without demand, commanded respect without confrontation, and foreshadowed the moment when the ordinary order of ceremony would be transformed by recognition of a life lived with honor, integrity, and unwavering commitment. Harold Winter's gaze shifted slightly toward the small metal pin to his lapel, the sunlight glinting off its worn surface, reflecting a history of service that had been quietly carried through decades. Sergeant Kyle Harper's posture stiffened, every instinct screaming caution, as the weight of Harold's presence pressed into the space between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Captain Hayes, standing nearby, allowed himself a slow exhale, recognizing the precise moment when authority could no longer be questioned by those who lacked understanding, and moved subtly to observe the unfolding situation without interfering prematurely. Harold's hand brushed against the edge of the pin once more, the gesture almost involuntary, a connection to the countless missions, decisions, and moments of silent leadership that had defined his life, each one a quiet testament to experience far beyond the young corporal's comprehension. The breeze lifted again, rustling through the crisp fallen leaves along the edges of the pathway, carrying the faint metallic tang of the gravestones and the distant hum of engines, a soundtrack to the tension mounting around the gate. Harper's voice faltered, the certainty that had grounded his commands now wavering, as Harold's calm, steady gaze met his, the pale blue eyes unwavering, reflecting the depth of knowledge and presence that came only from decades of service and understanding. The crowd, having sensed the subtle power shift, remained hushed, their collective attention drawn to the unassuming figure who commanded recognition not through words or raised voice, but through the sheer weight of his lived experience, the integrity of his posture, the quiet authority etched into every line of his being. Harold stepped another deliberate pace forward, each footfall measured against the gravel path, the motion gentle yet purposeful, conveying an inevitability that no argument, no regulation, no protest could alter. Captain Hayes' eyes scanned the perimeter, noting the tension in the guard's shoulders, the micro-expressions of uncertainty that had begun to replace arrogance with hesitation, aware that the moment of acknowledgment was approaching and that the balance of power would soon reveal itself. The pin on Harold's lapel seemed to shimmer in the shifting light, small and unassuming, yet imbued with the significance of countless deeds carried out with precision and dedication, a silent emblem that commanded respect without declaration. The sun moved slightly higher, casting longer shadows across the marble markers and neatly arranged rows of graves, emphasizing the stillness and focus of the moment, every element of the environment aligning with the quiet gravity Harold brought with him. Harper's fingers twitched, the rigid confidence beginning to crumble, as each subtle movement Harold made underscored his authority, his history, and the invisible weight of decades spent serving with diligence and unwavering commitment. The breeze continued to stir, rustling the ribbons on wreaths, brushing against the stone surfaces, a gentle reminder that even in silence, recognition and respect were powerful forces, shaping the perceptions of those who bore witness. Harold's posture remained steady, eyes scanning the horizon, calm and assured, signaling through every measured step, every subtle gesture, that his place was earned, not granted, and that the moment for the full acknowledgement of his presence and service was near. Captain Hayes maintained his position, alert and patient, eyes keenly observing every nuance, the quiet anticipation building, sensing the precise instant when the ordinary course of the ceremony would be transformed by the arrival of rightful authority, and when the surrounding guards would recognize, without words, the extraordinary life standing before them, the decades of quiet, unyielding dedication waiting to be honored. Harold Winters paused for a moment, the faint rustle of leaves drifting across the cemetery like a whispered prelude to the moment that was building, his pale blue eyes scanning the line of guards whose confidence had slowly begun to erode under the weight of his presence. The small pin on his lapel caught a shaft of sunlight, glinting subtly, unremarkable to the untrained yet heavy with history, a key to decades of silent service and acts performed without fanfare or recognition. Sergeant Kyle Harper's hands tightened at his sides, the tension in his posture betraying the struggle between the authority he had assumed and the undeniable command Harold carried simply by existing in that space. Captain Hayes took a deliberate step forward, maintaining just enough distance to remain unobtrusive while his gaze tracked the interactions closely, aware that any premature movement might disrupt the delicate unfolding of acknowledgement that hung in the crisp morning air. The faint hum of vehicles in the distance threaded through the rustling leaves, punctuating the soft, measured sounds of the cemetery, the crunch of gravel beneath boots, and the subtle creak of headstone edges settling in the earth, all composing a background score to the silent contest of presence and authority. Harold shifted slightly, just enough to signal attention without urgency, a small, almost imperceptible movement that drew every eye, reinforcing the quiet power emanating from his figure, the kind of presence that did not demand respect because it had already been earned, layered over decades of unspoken achievement. The young guards exchanged glances, subtle but loaded with the realization that their attempts to assert control were becoming irrelevant, the balance of the space bending imperceptibly to the experienced measure of Harold's stance, each gesture calculated and deliberate. A thin line of sunlit air filtered through the branches overhead, illuminating the small details, the folds of his suit, the slight glint of the pin, the subtle movement of his hands at rest, and in that light, the simplicity of his composure became a narrative unto itself, communicating authority, history, and quiet insistence without a word. Harold's attention flicked to the path where the motorcade had begun to arrive, the long black vehicles gliding slowly along the asphalt, their low hum carrying over the quiet cemetery, emphasizing the patience and anticipation inherent in the scene. Sergeant Harper swallowed, a tight sound, the practiced rigidity of his demeanor faltering as he recognized the inevitability of acknowledgement that was about to arrive, the moment when ordinary assumption of control would give way to earned respect, and no argument could alter it. Captain Hayes shifted slightly, keeping his stance unobtrusive but alert, ready to facilitate recognition without speaking, bridging the unseen gap between Harold's quiet command and the unfolding acknowledgement from the others present. The breeze lifted again, stirring the edges of uniforms, the ribbons on wreaths, the branches of trees lining the pathway, carrying a gentle reminder that some forces, like respect and history, are intangible yet undeniable, moving through spaces and people with a subtle, inescapable influence. Harold's posture remained unwavering, the quiet strength of decades etched into the straight line of his back, the set of his shoulders, and the deliberate placement of his hands at his sides, radiating calm, confidence, and authority. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, remained hushed, absorbed by the gravity of presence and the unfolding recognition, the atmosphere thick with anticipation, the ordinary flow of ceremony poised to transform as the silent yet profound weight of Harold Winter's history began to assert itself with unmistakable clarity, drawing every observer into the magnetic pull of acknowledgment that required no words. Only the recognition of an extraordinary life manifested in quiet, measured authority. Captain Hay's hand hovered just above his phone, ready to call the colonel, the subtle shift of his weight betraying the tension of anticipation as Harold Winters remained calm, every inch of him a study in composure and quiet authority. The young guards exchanged glances, the uncertainty clear on their faces, the rigid posture giving way to hesitation as if the air itself had grown heavier, carrying with it the unspoken acknowledgment of experience far beyond their years. Harold's eyes flicked to the line of approaching black sedans, the low hum of their engines threading through the rustle of leaves, each vehicle marking the steady progress of the funeral procession, unaware yet of the storm building at the gate. The sunlight caught the edge of his pen once more, casting a subtle reflection across the crisp uniforms of the guards, a small, innocuous object with the power to unlock the memory of service, the recognition of history, the quiet authority that demanded attention without declaration. Captain Hayes exhaled softly, recognizing the precise moment when intervention would be necessary, yet understanding that the weight of Harold's presence alone was already reshaping the dynamics, shifting control away from rigid rules toward acknowledgment of earned respect. Sergeant Harper adjusted his stance, the practiced rigidity of command beginning to falter as he noted the subtle firmness in Harold's posture, the measured calm in his voice, and the depth of presence that seemed to pull attention naturally, unspoken and undeniable. The crowd remained hushed, their attention drawn not to the ceremonial procession, but to the small scene unfolding at the gate, the interplay of authority, respect, and history, the anticipation thick in the crisp morning air, each observer sensing that the ordinary expectations of procedure were about to be quietly overturned. Harold moved another careful step forward, the gravel beneath his shoes responding with a soft, steady crunch, his movements deliberate, commanding without demanding, a natural rhythm that spoke to decades of discipline, experience, and service carried out with humility and precision. Captain Hayes stepped slightly closer, maintaining the delicate balance between observer and facilitator, eyes scanning for any sign that the situation might escalate, yet recognizing that Harold's quiet insistence was already guiding the path to acknowledgment, the invisible line between disrespect and recognition drawn by presence alone. The wind stirred again, brushing the edges of uniforms, rustling the leaves along the pathway, whispering against the marble markers, a subtle accompaniment to the quiet power radiating from Harold Winters, a gentle but firm reminder that respect is often unspoken yet universally understood. Sergeant Harper's confidence continued to waver, the edge in, his voice replaced by cautious observation, each glance at Harold reinforcing the realization that the ordinary structures of authority were secondary to the history, the experience, and the quiet command embodied in the older man. The crowd remained still, absorbed by the unfolding scene, the hushed silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the motorcade and the soft rustle of autumn leaves, a tableau of anticipation, recognition, and the inexorable arrival of overdue respect. Harold's eyes swept once more across the gate, across the line of guards, the observing captain, and the quiet watchers at a distance, every detail noted, every gesture measured, as he prepared for the final shift in the moment, the inevitable acknowledgement that would realign authority with earned legacy, that would transform the ordinary ceremony into a scene of silent reverence, where presence, history, and quiet mastery spoke louder than words ever could, and the subtle tension in the air became a testament to the weight of a life lived with discipline, courage, and unwavering commitment. The distant hum of the approaching vehicles grew subtly louder, a low vibration beneath the soles of Harold Winter's shoes, blending with the faint whisper of leaves stirred by the morning breeze, the rhythm of the cemetery holding its breath in anticipation. Sergeant Kyle Harper shifted uneasily, the rigid stance beginning to betray the internal recalibration of authority, each glance toward Harold punctuated by hesitation, a recognition that the assumptions he had relied upon were being quietly dismantled. Harold's gaze remained unwavering, the pale blue eyes calm and steady, capturing every micro-movement of the guards, the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of fists at sides, each detail recorded, measured, and acknowledged, a silent ledger of respect and command. Captain Hay's presence nearby remained controlled, a quiet sentinel, ensuring that the unfolding scene retained its order while allowing the natural authority of Harold to assert itself, the balance delicate yet undeniable. The sunlight shifted as the morning progressed, catching the small pin on Harold's lapel once more, glinting against the dark fabric of his suit, a symbol unassuming to most but laden with decades of history, a quiet trigger for recognition that went beyond words, beyond rank, beyond ceremony. The gravel underfoot responded with subtle crunches as Harold took another measured step forward, each motion deliberate, echoing with the weight of experience and the inevitability of acknowledgment that was drawing near. Sergeant Harper's jaw tightened, his attempts to reassert control becoming muted against the unspoken authority Harold radiated, the certainty of command replaced by cautious observation and an emerging comprehension of the moment's gravity. The crowd remained hushed, leaning in slightly, sensing the invisible threads of respect being rewoven around the old veteran, the soft murmur of leaves and distant engines forming a quiet underscore to the scene, emphasizing the shift from presumed authority to earned recognition. Harold's hands remained lightly clasped at his sides, posture straight but relaxed, movements economical yet charged with purpose. Every gesture a silent reinforcement of the depth of his presence, the decades of service and discipline visible in the simple alignment of body and gaze. Captain Hay stepped forward almost imperceptibly, the subtle motion serving as an acknowledgment and an unspoken communication to Sergeant Harper and the other guards that the forthcoming recognition was sanctioned, the final measure of authority ready to manifest. The wind lifted again, brushing the edges of uniforms and gently swaying the ribbons on the wreaths, carrying a faint metallic scent from the gravestones, layering a quiet tension that pressed against the subtle uncertainty now etched into the young guard's expressions. Harold's eyes traced the path of the approaching vehicles, registering their slow progress, the low hum of engines mixing with the morning air, each moment adding weight to the anticipation, each breath measured against the inevitable acknowledgment that was about to unfold. Sergeant Harper's stance faltered further, the rigidity of command softened by the unmistakable presence of someone whose life had been defined by quiet authority, the kind that needed no words to command attention, only recognition from those who could perceive it. The crowd, fully absorbed now, maintained a respectful stillness, every observer sensing the convergence of history, duty, and silent mastery in the figure before them. The ordinary order of the ceremony poised to be transformed by the gravity of experience and the recognition that Harold Winter's presence demanded. Harold took a subtle step forward, the gravel shifting softly underfoot, the gesture deliberate, a quiet declaration that his place had always been earned, and now, without ceremony or proclamation, the surrounding space responded, the young guards and onlookers alike beginning to register the profound authority carried in decades of service, the calm certainty of a life defined by discipline, commitment, and the quiet assertion of earned respect, drawing every eye, holding every breath, and setting the stage for the final arrival of acknowledgment that would shift the balance of power in the morning light. The soft rumble of the motorcade faded as the first figure emerged, General Robert Wallace stepping onto the Gravely path with measured authority, his presence commanding immediate attention without a word, the sharp lines of his uniform crisp against the muted tones of the cemetery, a living embodiment of tradition and respect. Harold Winters straightened subtly, a quiet nod acknowledging the arrival, eyes meeting the general's with a depth of understanding forged through years of shared service, the pale blue gaze steady and unflinching, carrying the weight of decades of experience. Sergeant Kyle Harper froze mid-step, the rigid posture dissolving into a mixture of awe and uncertainty as the general's measured stride drew nearer, every observer sensing the shift in the air, the quiet but absolute recalibration of authority. Captain Hayes allowed himself a small, controlled exhale, observing how the presence of both men, the veteran and the general, created a gravitational pull of attention, the silence of the cemetery amplified by the tension, the anticipation, the long pause before recognition. Harold's hand brushed the edge of the pin on his lapel once more, the subtle glint catching the sunlight as if signaling the culmination of decades of silent service, the emblem small yet commanding, a symbol understood by those who had lived the code of duty and honor. The general's eyes scanned the assembly briefly, resting on Harold with a mixture of acknowledgment and measured respect, his lips tightening in a quiet line that carried more weight than any speech, a simple gesture enough to command attention and silence. The crowd remained utterly still, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that an extraordinary moment was unfolding, a convergence of presence, history, and recognition that transcended ceremony or protocol, rendering previous assumptions of authority inconsequential. Harold took a single, deliberate step forward, his movements unhurried, each measured, every subtle motion reinforcing the quiet power he carried, a lifetime of experience distilled into a calm and commanding presence, visible to every eye, felt by every observer. Sergeant Harper's confidence faltered completely, the sharpness in his voice now replaced by a hesitant acknowledgment, a silent acquiescence to the authority embodied in Harold Winters and validated by the unmistakable presence of General Wallace. Captain Hayes watched intently, ensuring the delicate balance of order remained intact, yet allowing the natural unfolding of recognition to occur, the space itself bending imperceptibly to the weight of service, respect, and quiet mastery embodied by the veteran. The breeze stirred again, whispering through the trees, brushing the ribbons on wreaths, shifting slightly over the polished surfaces of the gravestones, the cemetery itself holding a collective breath, attentive to the moment when respect would be rendered not through proclamation, but through acknowledgment, through stillness, through presence. Harold's eyes met the general's one final time, a silent exchange, a recognition that bridged decades, battles fought, and service given without fanfare, and in that gaze, the young guards and onlookers felt the invisible authority, the settled truth that this man's life, his decades of service, and the respect he had earned were undeniable, unchallengeable, and fully acknowledged. The motorcade continued its slow approach, yet all eyes remained on the gate, where Harold stood, tall despite age, calm yet commanding, the culmination of a lifetime of dedication made visible, palpable, undeniable, and the subtle shift in energy, the stillness of breath, the unspoken respect radiating outward, ensured that the ordinary order had been irrevocably transformed. Every observer now aligned with the gravity of the moment, witnessing the final acknowledgment that had long been owed. The quiet moral settling like a gentle weight upon the shoulders of all present, the understanding that respect is not demanded, it is earned, and when earned, it cannot be denied.